The standoff at the state capitol continues. Is there any end in sight?
I think a lot of the attention is on the House, where I think, as Jeremy has mentioned, there just isn't, there aren't the votes. Perhaps they've got 7 Republicans that can side with the 24 Democrats to get it out on a simple majority.
The latest from those covering the Capitol, and a University of Arizona journalism graduate student looks at free press and free speech issues in the Middle East that are having effects on the Tucson campus.
This has caused quite a controversy on the campus. There is an official complaint filed with the Dean of Students office. There was a petition that gathered about 3,000 signatures of students that want the Dean of Students office to take action.
Stay tuned, it's Arizona Week.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chihar.
1 year ago today, the Arizona legislature adjourned, having passed the state budget and completed all its other work. Today, there's no budget, little open talk of passing a budget, and no clear path to lawmakers completing their business and going home. For an update on what's going on, legislative reporter Jo Pitzel of the Arizona Republic and Governor's Office reporter Jeremy Duda of the Arizona Capital-Times join me from Phoenix. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Michael.
Mary Jo, you wrote in your blog, Political Insider for the Republic this week, that the Medicaid expansion debate is stalled and something is going to jar it loose sooner or later. Will it be sooner or later, and what'll jar it loose?
It's very hard to predict when something will move on Medicaid. We did see a little movement this week on abortion, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. What will jar it loose? Well, either some cataclysmic event brought on by the governor's office, which would force lawmakers to feel like they must vote for expansion, which is something that she's insisted upon, or just such adamant opposition that that perhaps they retreat to a plan B, which could be putting this matter on the ballot this fall.
And Jeremy, you had a story this week for the Capital-Times reporting on the meetings that Governor Brewer is having with Republican legislators to try to persuade them, or perhaps even convince them, to vote for the Medicaid expansion. Is that a path to jarring this thing loose?
I'm not entirely sure. They don't really seem to have jarred too many people with that. A lot of those people are on the fence. At least publicly, they're not saying which way they're going to go. But some of them are opposed. Pretty forthrightly. Some of them are very openly leaning towards it. I don't know that those meetings really changed a lot of minds, but the governor, she's going to keep that open dialogue. She's still got votes to round up, especially in the House. So I think she's going to keep that up. She's going to keep up the pressure with some of these big events she's been holding at the Capitol, with this Chamber of Commerce-led campaign that's running commercials right now. She's going to try and keep that pressure up on all fronts.
So, Jeremy, you think there will be more of these meetings with Republican legislators behind closed doors?
Yeah, the governor's office told me they're going to continue those, but it's hard to say whether or not they're really going to do much good. What seems like it's having more of an effect is this information we got from the federal government last week, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, basically saying that the most likely scenario is that Arizona cannot continue its status quo right now, where we've frozen enrollment for childless adults in access, but we're still getting a 2-to-1 federal match for that. Now, the feds said they are probably not going to allow that to continue, which eliminates the option that a lot of expansion opponents wanted, which was just kind of keep the status quo. Unless we're willing to shell out, $850 million over the next few years to pay for that coverage all on our own, that's not going to work. And that's basically leaving people in the situation of saying, well, there really aren't any other options. And so that might be what really ultimately moves things along for the governor.
Mary Jo, you've reported, and many have reported, that Senate President Andy Biggs is adamantly opposed to this, will try to avoid bringing it to the floor for a vote. Is that a real barrier here, or does the issue really exist in the other chamber, the House of Representatives, where Speaker Andy Tobin hasn't had a lot to say about where he is on this?
As it stands right now, the bigger obstacle and attention goes over to the House. Speaker Tobin has, he hasn't come out against Medicaid expansion. He hasn't come out, for it. He's said he doesn't like the version that the governor's proposed, and he's trying to get some changes put in there. And that list of changes or the concessions that he wants seems to sort of shift every time you talk to him. But they include a 2/3 vote to put this thing, to treat this as a tax increase, which would require a 2/3 vote from the legislature, which essentially kills the bill, and a couple of other provisions. So I think a lot of the attention is on the House, where I think, as Jeremy has mentioned, there just isn't, there aren't the votes. To perhaps they've got 7 Republicans that can side with the 24 Democrats to get it out on a simple majority, but to do a 2/3 vote is far, far away. And Tobin's trying to find a way. Many believe that he's trying to find a way to make that happen, but it's totally not clear.
And Jeremy, Brewer has said repeatedly, and her spokesman has said repeatedly, that she gets what she wants. When she digs in her heels, and that's the exact words that have been used, when she digs in her heels, she gets it. And they make reference to the 2010 education sales tax, which she pushed against the wishes of the Republican legislature, and it happened. Is this an even bigger issue for her, and will she get what she wants?
It's hard to say whether it's bigger, but I mean, I think most people assume that eventually she'll get what she wants. It's just kind of hard to see what the path to victory is right now, because everything's stalled right now over Medicaid and the budget, and they can't finish a budget until they figure out what they're going to do with Medicaid. And if you get to the end of the session, or the end of the fiscal year in June, and they pass a budget that doesn't have Medicaid in it, I think we're going to see kind of a repeat of 2009, where she just vetoed half of the budget and then called them right back into special session. I mean, she's not going to let them leave without passing this Medicaid plan. She doesn't want to refer it to the ballot. It has to be decided by the end of the year, and I think she's going to keep him there as long as she needs to.
Now,
I think another point, Michael, is that yes, certainly 2009 and 10 showed us that the governor gets what she wants, but it is sort of a question of how she gets it, because if you recall with the penny sales tax, she wanted the legislature to approve that, and they wouldn't. So finally, she had to resort to a plan B, which was the ballot, and I don't think that that's out of the question on the Medicaid fight.
although on this, she has said, Mary Jo, that she doesn't want it to go to the ballot, maybe just continuing to keep the pressure up on the legislature to pass it, right?
Sure. Yeah. Why would you concede anything at this point?
And is that an option from your perspective, Jeremy? Would she, as a last resort, say, okay, let's just put it before the voters?
Well, right now they're saying that's absolutely not on the table. If things went far enough and she still hadn't gotten anything, then you might not be left without a choice. But then you still have to figure that leaves open the question of what exactly you do, at the end of the year when our current agreement with Medicaid runs out, and we either have to start funding these last 60,000 or so childless adults ourselves, or just cut them off from coverage altogether, which most people, in both parties don't want to see right now.
Just about a half minute remaining, Mary Jo, in that time. Any repercussions starting to show up for what could happen with the 2014 election cycle? Even though it's a long ways off, there are already people starting to talk about it.
Oh yeah, well also there's many exploratory committees being filed for legislative races, and other folks that are just jumping in saying, I'm going to be a candidate. And I think a lot of this is, you're seeing these are Republican candidates who are looking to perhaps give a primary challenge to other Republicans.
Mary Jo Pitzel of the Arizona Republic, Jeremy Duda of the Arizona Capital Times, thanks so much for speaking with me today about Medicaid and what's going on with the legislature. We'll keep up with the unfolding story on future episodes. And now a change of pace. We turn to Britton Eakin, a graduate student in journalism and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Arizona. She has 2 interviews on issues of free expression in the Middle East, and then talks with us about how the issues are reverberating in Tucson. First, her interview with journalism professor Kemper.
Recently, an Egyptian comedian was arrested on charges of insulting Islam, as well as Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. How should Americans understand this?
Well, Egypt obviously has gone through a lot of changes over the past few years, and Egypt's making decisions of their own, democratic decisions, in fact, of what kind of laws should we have, what should influence who we are and what we do. And as they're going through that, there is a strong Muslim influence in Egypt. And there are people who would like to apply some, if not all, of those concepts to what the Egyptian government does. And so in the Muslim world, there are times there's a cause of action legally that can be taken when people insult Islam, or when they say things or behave in ways that's inconsistent with what Islam teaches.
Is it fair to say that freedom of expression is an American value?
Oh, absolutely not. I think, as I've studied for a very long time, the idea of freedom of expression, and then now teach a course about it here at the University of Arizona, freedom of expression is not just a Western ideal, that we can find expressions of it in various cultures. Let me give you a very local example. My specialty looks at indigenous peoples and their views about freedom of expression. The Navajo Nation, the largest indigenous group in the United States, here in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, an excellent, well-developed government court system. One of their leading cases about free speech uses traditional law to explain kind of a Navajo concept of freedom of expression. And their goals with freedom of expression can be summarized, if I understand correctly, as promoting social harmony. So freedom of expression has a purpose, which is to support, build up the people. That's a little different than the Western individualistic notion of we can say whatever we want. But I don't think we ought to be quick to be critical of how other people approach free expression until we first understand it. Then we can engage with it and ask, is it good?
So a tweet of American comedian Jon Stewart lashing out at the Egyptian president was removed from the Twitter feed of the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. Sparked a bit of a diplomatic incident. Does the removal of the tweet violate our understanding of free speech?
That's a very good question. It's an American commenting. Even if it weren't an American, the U.S. Embassy deleted something. It removed it so people wouldn't see it. And let's be fair, the U.S. government, regardless of the administration or the party in charge, has been known over the years to do things for its own self-serving purposes and to violate freedom of the press, freedom of speech. I was just as much concerned about the removal of the tweet as I am a comedian who gets in trouble for using rhetorical hyperbole to make a political point.
President Obama took office on promises of transparency, but recent reports say 6 whistleblowers have been charged under his administration. What is the current state of press freedom in the U.S.?
I think the most freedom of the press we ever had was in the 60s and early 70s. When you look at the case law, the environment, I think probably after 9/11, maybe before, we saw a really serious decrease in government transparency. I have a theory about what's happened with the Obama presidency that I haven't been able to prove, but I'm willing to talk about in public, so maybe people will look into it. I think that President Obama was sincere when he took office that he wanted more transparency. And then he learned what the country and the government was dealing with and then had to respond to that. I think that when Attorney General Ashcroft issued his infamous memo about records, we thought, oh my goodness, it's going to get darker, less sunshine. President Obama issued a memorandum right when he took office reversing that policy. But yet I can say, as somebody who still does some journalism and with students do journalism, past year I've made a couple of requests for records from the federal government. I don't think the responses I have got have been what I think the law would have allowed. I have a lot of concerns. I'm very cautious to put the blame on President Obama, but because he is president, I think he has responsibility to address that. I think that after 9/11, we were forced to adopt some policies that really has made this a fundamentally different country.
Freedom of expression is sacrosanct in America. Juxtapose that with Muslim beliefs that are just as strongly held, and there's conflict. For a closer look, Brittany Eakin spoke with Faten Ghosn, U of A professor of government and public policy and a Middle East expert.
Are we expecting too much too quickly from the Arab Spring revolutions?
It depends what do you mean by expecting and what's too much. I mean, I think we have to remember, if we think back to the studies on transitions, what's happening is very normal. If you think back in Latin America, the transition of the third wave, which we talk about in Latin America, what's happening in the Middle East is not unusual, what we see elsewhere. We had economic problems which led to the protests, which led to the failure of certain regimes. But I think what's one problem that we have in the Middle East is by calling them as Arab awakening, we are lumping different phenomena. And so what really happens in the Middle East from a political science perspective is two different dynamics. You've got the protests, such as that were in Egypt, in Tunis, in Bahrain, some in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan. Those were really protests, a demand for economic, political reform. But what we saw in Libya, what we saw in Yemen, and what we saw in Syria are challenges to the state of taking over by one group that believes it wants to be in charge of running the state rather than a population protesting and wanting taking down a regime. So those are two different phenomena, and the media has tended to make them sound as they're one thing, and they're not. So the only two that we really have are Tunis and Egypt. And I think, yes, it is too soon. A lot of good things are happening, and a lot of not so good things are also happening.
What do you think Americans need to know about how things are unfolding, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia? Let's focus on those two countries.
So in Egypt, the fact of the matter that now we've had 2 rounds of elections and we've seen relatively an acceptance of those elections is pretty good, because in some sense we've moved away from a person dictating the outcomes to people abiding by, despite the fact that they were very close elections and some people were not satisfied with the outcome, yet they abided by the results, which is something that's extremely important when we're thinking about democratic mechanisms. So we definitely saw that. We've seen the judiciary come out in the sense when the President Morsi attempted to sign in these new constitutional protections whereby he and certain members of the council would be immune to judicial. We quickly saw the judiciary overturn it and say that that's not constitutional and that violates. So that's extremely important, where we've seen the judiciary come out. We also saw the judiciary, unlike in some other countries, where charges were brought up against some individuals that believed to have committed crimes during the previous regime, but there was no evidence. And so the judiciary, rather than just abiding by the emotional anger, which is real, they said, no, there is no evidence, and given the evidence, go gather evidence. I cannot rule based off of what I have. So yes, was the outcome satisfactory? No. But was it the right thing to do for a democratic system to move forward? Yes.
What about the issue of cracking down on political dissent, particularly in the case of Bassem Youssef? How would you contextualize that?
Well, I mean, the situation with Bassem Youssef, which is interesting in the sense that they did, take him for about questioning. I don't know if it was 5 hours or a little bit more, but they did release him on bail, right? In the past, even under Mubarak, whether or not you'll be released, that was a totally different, that was not even an option maybe. And so the fact of the matter that, yes, was it maybe not the right thing to do, but they felt enough pressure that they did release him.
What is your take on how the U.S. media is covering the Arab Spring uprisings and the Middle East and North Africa in general?
This would answer it. I don't watch the media, I only read print. Because I don't think we've done, since 9/11, I don't think we've done a fair enough job of reporting. It's more people and what people think, and not really actual investigative reporting, taking people down, interviewing multiple. We interview 1 or 2, and then all of a sudden we have the story and we understand. I read a minimum of 5 newspapers a day, 3 of which are from overseas. I tell my students, you got to read basic American newspapers, but I want you to also look overseas, because the same event is portrayed sometimes completely different. And sometimes information that you get from the Middle East is never reaches American media. So everything here, unfortunately, has now a moral undertone. And so there's not really investigative reporting. We're really not trying to dig deeper why, or to try to understand this, or to put them in a context. Like, what led to this event? Sometimes, 5 things may have happened before that, and yet we only focus on this one event and make it sound as if it just happened in vacuum and be shocked and react to it. And so I don't think the media in the US has done a fair enough job of presenting what's really going on the ground.
So in relation to this, I would like to ask you about the anti-Islam video that sparked some violent protests. Was there a larger geopolitical context to those protests?
Well, I think you'll have to understand 2 phenomena. In the Middle East, even in Lebanon, the case of Lebanon, during Christmas, one of the Shiite channels presents a kind of like a series about Jesus. And even in that series about Jesus, and they discuss him because they believe him, he's a prophet and very important role, they never show his face. So it's always a white light. So it's not that they're treating the prophet Muhammad different from prophet Jesus. It's the same that we don't know, and we shouldn't, whether that's right or wrong, that's a different, but even throughout when presenting the prophet Jesus. So there's a whole respect for religious individuals that maybe is not seen in the same light in the West. So that's different.
Britt Eakin joins me now for discussion and analysis. Welcome, and nice job on those interviews.
Thank you, Michael.
What led you to choose those 2 professors for these interviews?
Well, Dr. Faten Ghosn is from Lebanon. She grew up there. She travels back and forth between the Middle East and the US quite a bit, so she's very familiar with the politics and the histories and cultures of these places. She also specializes in conflict resolution and diplomacy, so I thought she could provide sort of a unique perspective in terms of helping provide valuable information that offers a little more nuance and context than we generally get in American media. I'm actually in class this semester with Dr. Kemper, and he specializes in media law. He's an expert on First Amendment issues, but he also has a very unique perspective in that he understands some of the cultural issues with freedom of expression and trying to apply that concept universally to different cultures. So I thought he could provide some good analysis as well.
And he did. And you have your own unusual perspective because not only are you a journalism major, but you're also working toward your master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies. And last summer, spent the summer in Cairo working for an English language newspaper. That experience, what did that bring to you for your studies?
Well, this is my first time actually trying to be a reporter in the Middle East. So I kind of just jumped in. It was a sink or swim kind of moment, and I actually covered environmental issues and not politics. But I did find that there is a bit of mistrust in Egypt. I was definitely accused of being an Israeli spy, accused of being CIA. And these accusations are not unfounded. The US has been involved in covert activities in the Middle East for a long time.
Through journalists?
Sometimes through journalists, but it does make it difficult to gain people's trust. Fortunately, I didn't have too many problems as a reporter, and I was able to get people to speak with me. But what I realized while I was there is that there are a lot of other issues, important issues, that are not being covered. Politics, the revolutions are not the only thing going on in these countries. I discovered that there's an incredible grassroots movement to awaken awareness about environmental issues, sexual harassment of women, and all kinds of different things. So there are lots of stories out there, and I was able to tap into some of these other issues while I was there.
Let's talk about the sexual harassment issue, which you said you experienced a little bit of when you were in Cairo as a woman and as a female journalist, right?
Well, I experienced a bit of harassment just walking down the street, which isn't all that different than what I might experience here, walking down the street as a woman. But there were reports of pretty brutal sexual assaults in Tahrir Square when I was there. So that did deter me from being in Tahrir Square during certain times. So I sort of developed a personal code of conduct for myself. I decided I wouldn't be in Tahrir Square after dark, and I would leave before the protests got really big. And when I say really big, I mean, you know, over a couple 100,000 people. Because there were definitely some bad things happening to women in the square. So I decided that I wouldn't put myself at risk in that regard, but I do think that anytime you have a situation where women are being intimidated from bearing witness or participating politically, there's a serious issue that needs to be dealt with.
Let's bring this home now. Protests, demonstrations, freedom of expression right here on the University of Arizona campus have had reverberations from what's going on in the Middle East. And you've covered some of that and you've witnessed some of it. Talk about that.
Well, I think it's a good place to start with Ann Coulter's recent appearance on Sean Hannity's show on Fox News, where she was talking about the wife of the deceased Boston bombing victim and said that this woman ought to be in jail just for wearing hijab. This was a concerning statement for me.
Hijab is the
veil. Headscarf, the covering that Muslim women wear. Now, she made this statement, and you know, how seriously can we take Ann Coulter? But the thing is, her words do have impact and do affect the climate that we live in, and may even impact how some people think about certain issues. I believe it was that day or the day after, there was an incident here on campus with Brother Dean, who spat at a Muslim woman wearing hijab and called her a terrorist. Brother Dean has also been involved in some recent controversy with holding up signs that say you deserve rape and you deserve STDs. He's speaking to women on campus, telling them if you dress immodestly, what do you expect? You're going to get raped. This has caused quite a controversy on the campus. There is an official complaint filed with the Dean of Students' office. There was a petition that gathered about 3,000 signatures of students that want the Dean of Students' office to take action and have Brother Dean removed from engaging in this kind of speech on campus. I haven't been able to hear directly from the Dean of Students' office, but there was an op-ed in the Wildcat that said, you know, for the time being, his speech is protected, and the way that we should deal with this issue is not by silencing him, but by addressing his speech with more speech.
Britt Neekin, master's candidate in the School of Journalism and the Middle Eastern Studies program here at the University of Arizona. Thanks for speaking with me.
Thank you, Michael.
Full versions of Britton's interviews with Professors Kemper and Ghosn are at azweek.com. That's our program for Friday, May 3rd, 2013. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Chihak.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.